3 envelopes. $80 each. No explanation. Warren Duff set them on the kitchen table of the house he had built from nothing, the same table where his daughters had done their homework, where his late wife Agnes had folded laundry on Sunday mornings while the radio played. He was 62 years old and had not slept well in months. Not because of the business, which ran without much help from him now, not because of his health, which was fine, but because of a question he could not stop asking himself quietly, drive to the office and back, and sometimes at 3 a.m. standing at the window with a glass of water going warm in his hand. He did not know who his daughters were when nobody was watching. He had built Duff Construction from a single truck and a rented compressor in Sudbury, Ontario. 40 years. 3 provinces. A company now worth more than he ever let himself imagine in the early years, when every contract felt like it might be the last one. He had learned what it meant to go without. Not as a lesson, not as a story he told at dinners, but in the body. The kind of knowing that sits in the hands. He remembered being 24 and eating crackers for 3 days because the float was dry and the next check hadn't cleared. He remembered calling his father to ask for a loan and being told, gently but plainly, no. He had never forgotten the shape of that no. Agnes had died 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Warren had sat beside her hospital bed in the last week and held her hand and listened to her breathe and understood. With the particular clarity that only arrives when you are losing something irreplaceable, that he had let the company take up too much of the space that should have belonged to her and to the girls. He had provided. That was not nothing. But providing and being present were not the same thing, and he had spent 20 years confusing the two. His daughters were adults now. Meredith was 31, the eldest. She had come into the business 4 years ago, carrying herself through the office the way certain people carry themselves through rooms they believe they are entitled to. Not rudely, not even consciously, but with the settled assumption that the space would arrange itself around her. She had her mother's jaw and her father's stubbornness at naught, but she had also absorbed somewhere along the way a belief that the Duff name was a kind of passport. She answered emails from her phone at family dinners. She approved budgets she hadn't read in full. She wore the title of Director of Operations the way you wear a coat that fits, but that you've never had to earn through weather. Priya was 28. She had married into the family 3 years ago. Warren's son-in-law by way of his youngest, Celia, and had joined the company at Meredith's suggestion, managing client relations. She was sharp and well-liked and had a talent for making people feel heard that Warren had noticed immediately and said nothing about, which was a habit of his he'd come to regret. She had grown up in Timmins. Her parents had run a small grocery, and she had worked every weekend through high school. Warren respected this more than he had ever said out loud. Celia was 26. She had graduated 2 years ago with a degree in social work and was running a youth drop-in program out of a church basement in Sudbury's East End for $34,000 a year. Warren had offered her a position at the company twice. She had declined both times without much explanation, which had frustrated him until he started paying attention to the way she moved through a room, quietly, without announcement, picking up whatever had been left undone. On a Thursday evening in late April, Warren called all 3 of them to the house for dinner. Not to the office boardroom, not to the restaurant downtown where he took clients. To the house, with the old table and Agnes's ceramic lamp still on the sideboard, and the yellow kitchen that nobody had repainted because nobody had wanted to be the one to change it. He set 1 envelope in front of each of them. Inside each one, $80 in cash. He did not give a speech. He told them that starting Monday morning, each of them had $80 and 10 days. Their cards had already been suspended. The company credit accounts would not recognize them. The house code would change at 6 a.m. They could take what they were carrying. Their phones were for genuine emergencies only. They were not to contact each other for assistance. Meredith looked at the envelope and then at her father with the expression of a person who has been handed something they are waiting to find the punchline of. "You're serious," she said. It was not quite a question. Priya turned the envelope over in her hands slowly. She looked at Warren's face the way she looked at faces before important conversations, reading not the words but the intention behind them. She set the envelope down and picked it up again. She did not say anything. Celia looked at her father for a long moment before she looked at the envelope. She studied him the way you study someone when you want to understand not just what they're asking but what it's costing them to ask it. Then she reached out and took the envelope and set it in her jacket pocket. Warren had arranged the suspension of their cards the week before. He had spoken to HR. He had changed the garage code that morning and would change the front door code before dawn. This was not an impulse. He had been sitting with the question for 4 months and had spent 3 weeks making the arrangements once he decided. He didn't say any of that. He said goodnight and went upstairs, and listened to the sound of the front door closing once, then twice, then a third time, each with a slightly different weight. Monday came in gray and cold, the way April mornings come in northern Ontario when the season hasn't quite decided yet. Warren stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched the empty driveway for a long time after the last car had gone. Meredith Duff had never taken a hotel room that cost under $200 and felt the amount as a real number. She had charged rooms across the country to the company card, and the number had always been abstract, a line on a report someone else reviewed. She found this out at 10:15 Monday morning, standing at the front desk of a mid-range hotel on Larch Street, with $80 in an envelope and a leather overnight bag at her feet, listening to the desk clerk explain professionally and without evident pleasure that their lowest available rate was $94 per night. She stepped away from the desk and stood near the entrance and looked at the sliding doors for a while. She called her college friend Dominique, who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the New Sudbury area, and had enough warmth in her voice to say yes without making it awkward. By noon, Meredith was sitting on a pull-out sofa that smelled like dogs and old fabric softener, her overnight bag propped against a wall covered in framed prints of European cities Dominique had not visited. She went out for lunch because that was what she did at noon. She ordered a bowl of soup and a coffee at a diner on Berrydown Road, left a $3 tip out of habit, and walked back with $41. The math had not yet become real to her. It was still arithmetic, not consequence. Priya had left at 6 that morning. She had grown up in a house where 6 a.m. was already late, where her father had the store unlocked and the produce organized before most people had finished their first cup of tea. She walked out of the Duff house with a canvas bag, a transit map she'd downloaded the night before, and the focused comms of someone who had already run the numbers. She took the city bus to the public library on Mackenzie Street. She chose a table near the power outlets, opened a small notebook she'd brought, and wrote across the first page in her careful, slightly compressed handwriting. $80 a 10 days, $8 per day. Below that, 2 columns, essential, deferrable. Shelter went under essential with a question mark. She looked at the question mark for a moment, then crossed it out and wrote beside it, find another way. By early afternoon, she had located a women's shelter that offered short-term transitional beds for people in non-crisis situations on a first-come basis. She presented herself at the intake desk, explained honestly that she was not in danger, but had no housing access for 10 days and limited funds, and asked whether there was a way she could be useful in exchange for a cot. The intake coordinator, a tired woman named Bev, who had heard a great deal over the years, looked at her for a moment and said she could help with dinner prep tonight, and they'd sort out the rest in the morning. Priya thanked her and went to put her bag away. She spent $62.40 over the next 4 days on food and bus fare, recording each transaction to the penny in the notebook. The numbers were workable. She had done harder arithmetic in less comfortable circumstances. Celia had packed the night before. She had been doing this kind of work long enough to know what 10 days with limited resources looked like in the body, and she had packed accordingly. Layers, comfortable shoes, nothing that couldn't get wet. She left at 5:45, before the code changed, and walked east toward the drop-in center where she worked, because it opened early, and she knew where she was going. By Tuesday afternoon, the three of them were each in a different kind of difficulty, and none of them knew what the others were doing. Meredith had spent $39 by Tuesday evening without quite understanding how. A coffee here, a meal there, a bus ticket because she hadn't wanted to ask Dominique for a ride, and hadn't thought about walking. She sat on the pull-out sofa Tuesday night and looked at $41 on the cushion beside her and did the arithmetic slowly, and then did it again, and understood for the first time that the number was not going to change based on how she felt about it. She went through her contact list the way she went through vendor lists, methodically, looking for the line item that would solve the problem. A business contact in the flour mill area who owed her a favor, a former colleague who had a spare room, a client she'd lunched with 4 times who had once said, warmly and probably sincerely, to call if she ever needed anything. She did not call any of them. She got as far as opening each contact and then closing it, because the thing she needed was not professional, and most of the people she had accumulated over 4 years of working under the Duff name were not connected to her. They were connected to the company. Standing outside it now, she could see the difference plainly, in a way she had never needed to before. She called Dominique on Wednesday evening and asked, without preamble, whether she could stay through the end of next week. Dominique said, of course. The word arrived without hesitation, and Meredith sat with it for a moment before she could respond, because she could not remember the last time she had asked for something plainly, without the architecture of the company behind it, and received a yes that had nothing to do with what her last name could offer. Priya had a harder Wednesday. One of the women at the shelter, a woman named Adeze, who was navigating a custody situation while trying to hold a part-time cleaning job, asked her at dinner whether she knew anything about tenant rights documentation, whether a certain type of letter could be filed without a lawyer. Priya knew enough to understand the landscape of the question, but not enough to answer it responsibly. She spent 2 hours that evening at the library reading case documents online, and came back with 3 printed pages, and sat across from a Daisy at the kitchen table, and walked through them line by line, slowly, the way her mother had once sat across from her at a different kitchen table, helping her understand a different kind of paperwork that had felt insurmountable. She wrote 4 words in her notebook before she went to sleep, know enough to help. Thursday came hard for all of them, in different ways. Meredith had $22 left. She had been offered a short shift cashiering at a grocery store on LaSalle Boulevard by a manager who was visibly short-staffed and willing to put someone on for 4 hours without formal paperwork. She stood in the parking lot of that grocery store for 11 minutes before going in. She had a business degree. She was the director of operations of a 40-year-old construction company. She told herself that, and then she told herself that again, and then she walked through the door. What happened over the next 4 hours was not what she expected. She was slow at the till and said so, which the shift supervisor appreciated more than competence would have earned her, because honesty from new people was rarer. She made an error on a return and fixed it without drama. An older man with a cart full of cat food and frozen dinners, for one, told her she had a nice smile. He did not know she was anything other than what she appeared to be at that moment, which was a person working a till on a Thursday afternoon. She rang through his cat food and his frozen dinners, and said, "Have a good evening," and she meant it, and he left, and the next person stepped forward. At the end of the shift, the supervisor put $48 in her hand, cash, and told her she could come back Saturday if she wanted. She said she'd think about it. She thought about it for about 30 seconds on the sidewalk outside, and then texted him that yes, she'd be there. Priya had been asked by Bev to help run an intake session on Thursday morning, sitting at a small table with a clipboard, walking new arrivals through the initial questions: date of birth, emergency contact, any medical needs. She had done intake work before, in a different context, at a different kind of organization. But this was slower, and the questions landed differently when the person across the table was carrying everything she owned in a bag on her lap. A woman came in with a girl of about 7 who had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder. The mother answered the questions in a low, careful voice, the kind of voice people use when they're trying not to wake something they've worked hard to settle. Priya wrote down the answers and did not hurry and did not look at the clock. When the last question was answered, the woman said quietly, "Thank you for not making this worse than it already is." Priya said she was sorry it had to be anything at all. She meant it in a way that was specific and not performative, and the woman seemed to know the difference. She wrote in her notebook that night, "The form is not the point. The person filling it out is." Celia had spent the week between the drop-in center and the streets east of it, which she knew in the particular way you come to know a neighborhood when you have walked it consistently for 2 years in all seasons. She knew which doorways held wind, which Tim Hortons would let you sit without buying something, which community fridge got restocked on Wednesdays. On Tuesday she had found Raymond Ossie sitting on the low wall outside the post office on Elm Street. He was 64, wearing a Carhartt jacket that had been worn in and out of several winters, and he had the bearing of someone who had once occupied a different kind of space and had not entirely left it. He was reading a folded newspaper, the print edition, and he held it the way you hold a newspaper when you have been in the habit of holding newspapers for decades. Celia did not ask about his circumstances. She asked about the newspaper. He said he'd been a journeyman electrician for 31 years before his wife got sick, before the bills, before the sequence of events that he described the way people describe weather. Not without feeling, but without asking you to fix anything. His name was Raymond. His wife's name had been Delia. He had a daughter in Ottawa who called every 2 weeks and asked if he always said yes and to whom he always said yes. Celia listened the way she had trained herself to listen, without filling the pauses, without steering toward a conclusion. When they finished talking, she wrote 3 words in the pocket notebook she always carried. "The gap is specific." She came back the next day with a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, and Raymond was there. She came back the day after that. By Thursday, she understood what Raymond needed was not a shelter bed, which he'd been offered and declined, and not a food bank voucher, which he had and used. What he needed was a reason to be somewhere particular at a particular time, and to be known there. She wrote it down, reasons to return. Thursday night, each of them was at a different kind of low. Meredith sat in Dominique's kitchen with $51 she'd earned, and about 18 left of the original 80. She was not desperate in the practical sense. She had food, a place to sleep, and a shift on Saturday. But she was sitting in a kitchen that was not hers, in a city she had lived in her whole life, and she did not know what she would build with herself if the company were not there to build inside of. The question arrived plainly, without drama, and she could not push it back to where it had been. She had spent 4 years being Meredith Duff, director of operations. She had no idea whether the person who had stood at a grocery till on Thursday afternoon and meant it when she said "have a good evening" was the same one. She suspected the woman at the till might be more useful. Priya had spent most of Thursday thinking about Adaisy's documentation and whether there was more she could do, and had arrived at the answer yes, but carefully. She did not have legal training, but she had grown up watching her father navigate the paperwork of a small business, tax forms, supplier agreements, lease renewals, and she had absorbed something in those years that was not expertise, but was something adjacent to it, the ability to read a document for what it was actually asking, underneath what it appeared to be asking. She drafted a letter with Adaisy Thursday evening. It took 2 hours. She read it 3 times before she gave it to her. She was not certain it was right. She said so plainly and told Adaisy to show it to a duty counsel before she filed anything. Adaisy read the letter, folded it, and put it in her bag. Then she looked at Priya and said, "You didn't have to do that." Priya said she knew. She meant something by that, though she couldn't have said at that moment exactly what. Celia spent Thursday night at the drop-in center helping close up, stacking chairs, wiping tables, carrying the recycling out to the bin behind the building in the cold. She was not on the schedule. She had stayed because the staff person who was supposed to close had a sick kid at home, and Celia could see that she needed to go. She walked home in the dark past the wall where Raymond sat during the day, which was empty at this hour. She looked at the wall for a moment, then kept walking. She had $8.30 left. She had spent almost everything she had, and most of it on someone else's situation, and she arrived at a thought in the cold of that Thursday night that she had not quite been able to reach before. The point was not to survive the 10 days. Any of them could survive 10 days. The point was what you noticed when the familiar floor was gone. Whether you looked up or looked for a way back to the floor, she thought she understood now what her father had been asking. Not can you manage. He already knew they could manage. He was asking who they became when managing was the ceiling instead of the floor. Friday, Meredith walked into the public library on Mackenzie Street. She did not know that Priya had sat at the same table 4 days earlier. She did not know because they had not spoken all week, each of them too occupied with the specific weight of her own situation to think clearly about the others. She sat at a table near the window and did not open her phone. She had $41 and 3 days, and a shift on Saturday that would add 48 to that, and enough to finish the 10 days without real difficulty. The practical problem was solved. She had solved it in the way she solved most things, by finding the operational path through. She sat in the library for 2 hours and did not pretend to read. A small girl dropped a picture book from the table beside her. It landed flat on the tile with a sound like a hand slap. The girl's father was managing a stroller and did not notice immediately. Meredith picked the book up before she thought about it and set it in front of the girl, who said, "Thank you," in the automatic way of children who have been taught to. It was not a significant thing. It would not appear in any account of what changed for Meredith Duff that week. But her hand had reached out toward someone else's situation without calculating the return. And that reflex, so ordinary in most people, so long replaced in her by the management of outcomes, landed somewhere she had not expected. She sat for another hour after that. In the second hour she did not arrive at an answer, but the question, the actual one, became audible in a way it hadn't been before. She had spent 4 years being effective inside the company. She had no idea whether she was effective at anything that wasn't the company, and she was beginning to understand that these were not the same question with the same answer. She got up at noon and walked out into the April afternoon with a direction she hadn't had all week. Priya came to the end of the week having spent $67 total and having earned no money, which she had not tried to. She had kept meticulous records in the notebook, not because she thought anyone would ask to see them, but because keeping records was the thing that kept her oriented in uncertain situations. A habit her father had given her, though he would not have called it a lesson. He would have called it Tuesday. She had spent Thursday and Friday helping 2 other women at the shelter navigate the specific paperwork of their specific situations. Not as an advisor, not with any credential, but as someone who was willing to sit down and read carefully and say plainly what she understood and what she didn't. On Saturday morning, Bev asked her if she'd ever considered working in social services. Priya said she worked in client relations. Bev looked at her with the expression of someone who has been doing intake for 15 years and has developed an accurate eye for where people's actual skills live. "Same thing," Bev said. "Depending on what you think the client is." Priya wrote that in the notebook. She underlined it once. Celia spent Friday and the weekend quietly. She had almost nothing left of the $80 and no plan to earn more. Which she was not worried about, because she had always been able to eat on very little, and she knew where the community fridges were. She spent Friday afternoon with Raymond, this time on a bench in Bell Park near the water, where the wind came off Lake Ramsey still carrying a rim of winter in it. She had brought a legal pad and a pen. Not her notebook, the legal pad, the kind she used for program planning. She asked Raymond if he'd be willing to talk through what he knew, not about his situation, but about his trade. What it had taken to learn it. What a young person would need to know. She said she was asking because she thought there might be a use for it, though she didn't say yet what kind of use. Raymond looked at the legal pad. He looked at Celia. He asked what she was building. She said she wasn't sure yet, but she'd seen a gap and she thought he might fit in it. He looked at the water for a moment. Then he said all right and began to talk. Monday morning, Warren opened the gate at 6 a.m. Meredith arrived first at 9:15. She came through the front door with her overnight bag, the leather scuffed on one side from being set down on pavement multiple times. She did not look at her father when she came in. She went straight to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and drank all of it standing at the sink. Then she put the glass down and turned around. "I want to talk about the advisory program," she said. "Not to the board. To Warren directly. The one you mentioned 2 years ago, for small contractors in the region. I want to know if we can actually do it, not just talk about it." Warren looked at his eldest daughter. He had heard this kind of language from her before. Efficient, outcome-oriented, moving toward execution. But the shape of it was different this morning. It was not an announcement. It was a question that contained the possibility that the answer might require something from her, and she was asking it anyway. He said, "Tell me what you're thinking." Meredith told him. She talked for 8 minutes without looking at her phone. It was not a polished proposal. There were gaps in it, and she said so when she reached them, which she had never done before in any professional conversation he could remember. When she finished, Warren said, "I'd want community input before we build the structure." Meredith said, "I know someone at a church drop-in on the east side who might know who to talk to." Warren registered this. He said nothing about it, but he registered it. Priya came through the back door at 11. She set the notebook open on the kitchen table. The first page showed the budget, $80 divided by 10, 2 columns, careful handwriting. The last entries were from Sunday morning, $73 spent, $7.12 remaining. She set $7.12 on top of the notebook in coins and bills. Then she said, "I want to bring something up at the next leadership meeting. About how we handle client intake." Warren looked at the coins. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his daughter-in-law's hands, resting flat and open on the table, not in her jacket pockets, not reaching for her phone. He waited. "We treat the clients like problems to be managed," Priya said. "We're good at managing, but I think we've been optimizing for the wrong thing." She was quiet for a moment. The form is not the point. The person filling it out is. Warren asked her what she thought the point was. Priya said she had a few ideas she would like, if it was all right, to talk through them with Celia first. Warren said yes. Celia arrived at 2:40 in the afternoon. She came in quietly, hung her jacket on the hook by the door the way she always did, and placed 2 things on the kitchen table. The first was $8 in coins and small bills, everything remaining, arranged into a neat stack. The second was the legal pad. She opened it to the first page and set it in front of Warren. The first page was a site diagram, rough, hand-drawn but clear. A building footprint divided into sections. A ground floor workshop space. Above it, a series of small apartment units, 12 to start, with a note. Rent geared to income, not subject to market pressure. Beside the workshop section, in the same deliberate handwriting that had taken notes in Bell Park by the water, was a name, Raymond Ossie. Journeyman electrician, 31 years. Currently, bench outside Elm Street post office most mornings. Knows what it means to start over. Warren looked at the name for a long time. He read the note. He read it again. He looked up at Celia. "You didn't just plan a building," he said. Celia said, "I found someone who should be in it. He saw the gap before I named it." 5 words. Warren sat with them. He reached into the side drawer of the kitchen table. Agnes's table, bought at a shop in Espanola on their first anniversary, carried through 4 house moves, and took out a small envelope he had placed there the week before. Inside was a key. Not a metaphorical key, not a symbolic one. A small brass key on a ring with a tag that said workshop. It was the key to the warehouse space he had purchased in the Minnow Lake area 3 years ago, and told no one about, not his board, not his lawyers, not his children. He had been waiting to understand what it was for. He set the key beside the legal pad. Celia looked at the key. She did not reach for it. She seemed to understand that it was not yet hers to take. that it was being placed beside something to see whether the two things belonged together. They did. The next morning, Warren drove all three of them to the Minnow Lake warehouse without saying where they were going. The three women sat in the back of the truck with their shoulders nearly touching, the first time in a long while they had occupied that particular proximity. None of them spoke. Each was still carrying the week somewhere in her body. The building was a low, wide structure on a flat lot, surrounded by gravel and a chain-link fence on two sides, and on the third side a row of poplar trees that the wind moved through in long, slow waves. A hand-painted sign on the fence read, "Future Site, Duff Community Skills Center." Warren got out. His daughters followed. He told them he had purchased this property with his own money, not company funds, and had told no one. He told them what he wanted to build: a ground floor of trade workshops, electrical, carpentry, plumbing, basic finishing, for people who had lost their footing and needed to learn something they could use. Above that, 12 apartments with rents fixed below market and kept that way, not as a matter of policy subject to revision, but as a matter of structure. The building would not make money. It was not designed to. He told them he had not sent them out to punish them. "I needed to see," he said, "whether any of you could see what I've been seeing." He asked each of them the same question in the same voice. "If I gave you this lot, what would you build?" Meredith went first. She talked about phasing, about permit timelines, about working with a general contractor who had done municipal projects before. It was competent. It had logic and sequence and a realistic horizon. She heard herself saying it and heard what was absent from it, and she stopped before she reached the end. She looked at the gravel under her feet. "I'd want Raymond to be part of the design conversation," she said after a moment, "before we finalize anything, so we build around what's actually needed, not what we think is needed." Warren looked at his eldest daughter. At the pause she had left in the sentence, he said nothing, but he noted the pause. It was new. Priya was looking past Warren toward the building when her turn came. She looked at the flat roof and the row of poplars and the fence, and she said almost quietly, "There should be a room where people can sit and not have to explain why they're there. Just be somewhere warm." It was not a room on any floor plan. It was not a billable square footage. It was the intake coordinator's logic applied to architecture. The understanding that what people need first, before any program or service, is to exist somewhere without being processed. Bev had not taught her this with words. She had taught it by opening the shelter door without asking for a reason, and by saying nothing about the 2 days that had passed before Priya showed up. Warren felt something shift at that sentence. He had expected Meredith to surprise him in some small way, and she had. He had not expected Priya at all. And here she was standing at a chain-link fence in Minnow Lake talking about a room for being, and she had arrived at this from a notebook and a shelter kitchen, and 4 evenings of sitting across a table from women who needed someone to read carefully and mean it. Celia walked through the gate without asking. She moved around the perimeter slowly, the way she moved when she was learning the dimensions of something rather than measuring it. She crouched at the corner where the gravel met the concrete foundation, pressed her palm flat to the ground and held it there. Then she stood, opened the legal pad to a new page, and drew. She brought it back to Warren. The ground floor was divided clearly. Electrical on the left, carpentry at the back, plumbing and finishing along the right wall. The apartment units were above, 12 of them, with a note in the margin that said, "Windows east, facing where possible." People should see the morning. Beside the electrical workshop, in that had taken notes on a park bench by the water, was a name. Raymond Osei, lead, electrical, bench at Elm Street Post Office, mornings. Not a concept, not a proposed hire, a specific person at a specific place who belonged by the logic of the building as a load-bearing element, as though the structure could not stand right without him. Warren held the legal pad for a long time. "You didn't just plan a space," he said. "You put someone in it." Celia said, "He was already in it. I just drew the walls around him." The workshop on the ground floor opened on a Wednesday morning in late September. There was no ribbon cutting. Raymond Osei arrived first, the way he arrived at things now, deliberately, because the work was worth arriving early for. He unlocked the door with a key that had his name on the tag. The first key with his name on it in 3 years. He turned on the lights. The room smelled like fresh lumber and mineral oil, and the particular readiness of a space built for a purpose and about to encounter it. 3 other men came in over the first hour. One had been a plumber. One had never held a wire stripper. Raymond showed them where to stand and how to hold things and what to look for, the way he had learned. Slowly, without wasted motion, with the understanding that accuracy was not a personality trait but a practice. He pressed his thumb to a junction and adjusted a student's grip without speaking, then stepped back and said, "Now read it. Don't guess. Read it." Every project that left the workshop had 2 initials marked inside it somewhere small, where most people would not look. Meredith returned to Duff Construction, but not to the same version of the role. She initiated a regional advisory program for small contractors, sole proprietors, family operations, companies that could not afford the kind of counsel the company had always had access to. She accepted a reduction in her own compensation to fund the first 2 years. She still wore the same Oxford flats. She walked to meetings across the city now, sometimes 15 minutes each way, and her feet had learned the distances in the way feet learn things when there is no other option. Priya spent 2 days a week at the skills center managing the intake process she had designed, which looked nothing like a standard intake process. There was no clipboard at the front desk. There was a chair and a table, and a small lamp and a question. "What do you need right now?" She brought the same notebook she had carried during the 10 days, now full, to a meeting with Meredith in October. And what came out of that meeting was a proposal that neither of them could have written alone, which was how they knew it was probably right. Celia kept her position at the youth drop-in and took on a part-time advisory role at the skills center, developing the programming with Raymond's input at every stage. Her pocket notebook from the 10 days lived in the desk drawer of her small apartment 3 blocks from the center. Beside it, the small brass key her father had placed on the kitchen table. Scratched now, worn at the teeth, she kept it because the object itself was not the point, but the morning it had been set beside something. To see whether the 2 things belonged together was a morning she did not want to forget. Raymond Ossie had a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced east and caught the morning in the way Celia's floor plan had intended. On the small table under the window, a photograph of Delia taken in their kitchen in the years before everything changed. Beside it, a copy of the electrical code marked up with 31 years of his own notes in the margins. He kept the notes not as evidence of what he'd lost, but as evidence of what he'd been. Proof that a life accumulates, even when the accumulation becomes invisible for a while. On a morning in late October, Warren sat in the study of his house in Sudbury. Agnes's lamp on the sideboard, the table she had carried through 4 homes still solid under his hands. The light came through the west window the way it comes in the north in autumn, low, horizontal, completely without pretension. He opened the side drawer of the table. It was empty now. He did not feel this as a loss. He felt it as the specific relief of a person who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and has finally found the place it was always meant to go. He had built a company worth more than he had ever said out loud. He would keep building, but what he was building now could not be expressed in square footage or quarterly margins, or the kind of language that appeared in the annual reports he signed. Without looking at the page count, it was expressed in a man who arrived early because the work was worth it, in a daughter who had stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at her own shoes, in a room designed for being somewhere without having to explain why. In 6 words said at a chain-link fence in the wind. Warren closed the drawer. Outside, Sudbury spread across the Canadian Shield in the particular light of a northern October morning. Granite and birch, and the slow wide water of Ramsey, moving at its own pace, indifferent to appraisal, full of people carrying things no ledger could measure. He had not looked at the company financials in 4 days. He thought he might leave them until Monday. The next morning, Raymond arrived at the workshop before anyone else. The lights were off. The room held the smell of the previous day's work, wood dust and solder, and something without a proper name that meant useful things had happened here. On the bench in front of him was a small junction box he had wired and mounted the previous afternoon. He had taken no shortcuts. He had checked each connection twice before moving to the next. He ran his thumb along the seam. Even, clean, exactly what it needed to be. He turned it over, picked up the pencil from behind his ear, and pressed the tip into the soft label space on the underside, and wrote 2 initials in the same careful hand he gave every measurement. R.O. He turned it right side up, looked at it for a moment. Then he reached over, turned on the light, walked to the door, opened it, and the morning came in.